G'day, and welcome to the Seacreatures Podcast, a show all about the amazing animals that live beneath the waves. On each episode, we chat about a specific sea creature with a guest who is passionate and knowledgeable about this ocean animal. Our guests range from scuba divers to marine biologists, citizen scientists, underwater photographers, and even paleontologists.
Woo!
My name's Matt Testoni, and I'm most of the above. And joining me for this episode of the Seacreatures Podcast is Ben Francischelli, and he's a paleontologist, fossil hunter, and fossil curator. And today we're going to be talking all about Livyatan. And so, welcome to the show, Ben.
Thank you for having me, Matt. It is very exciting to be talking about this animal because there is nothing like it on the planet today.
Well, normally I'd kind of kick off the first question being like, tell us how you know about this animal.
Mm-hmm.
But I reckon we go back to that and jump into what this animal is, because I reckon most people don't know. So tell us what Livyatan is.
And it's understandable as well because it's such an obscure creature that lived so many millions of years ago. There's very little fossil evidence for it all around the world, so there's not much we can actually say about it. But the bits that we have found are sublime. So on the last podcast I joined you in, we talked about the Megalodon. The Megalodon is this fantastic shark, the biggest that ever existed. But at the same time that the Megalodon lived, there was another creature that also occupied those ancient waters from about 3 to 7 million years ago. Its name was Livyatan. It's a type of giant sperm whale. And what set this sperm whale apart from other modern sperm whales today is it had interlocking dentition, very different from modern sperm whales and only have teeth on the lower jaws, and quite possibly one of the strongest bite forces ever recorded in the animal kingdom. We suspect that Livyatan was a top-tier predator. So modern sperm whales today are only feeding primarily on large species of giant squid, but this thing we suspect was feeding on other whales when it was alive. It was probably part of the biggest predator-prey interaction that ever existed, and some of the material that we're finding is in Melbourne, which makes it extra exciting for me.
Yeah, that's so cool. Well, I mean, there's so many things I just want to unpack right there, but first of all, like, kind of paint a picture of how big Livyatan is and what it looks like and how it compares to a sperm whale, or what even it looks like if people don't know what a sperm whale is.
Yeah, so let's get into sperm whales first, because they're extraordinarily strange creatures when it comes down to it. I mean, if you ever look at a sperm whale's skull, it just looks like a giant satellite dish. It looks like it's missing half of its head, where these huge organs actually reside within it. When you're looking at something like a sperm whale, it looks like any other kind of whale. It's just got this big bulbous forehead at the front of its body. So modern sperm whales, like I mentioned before, only have teeth on their lower jaws, and they dive to incredible depths, more than 2 kilometers below the surface of the water, and can hold their breath for maybe a couple of hours. It's not the world record of breath holding, that belongs to beaked whales, but it's still a really long time. So there are 3 different species of sperm whale that live today. You've got your modern Physeter macrocephalus, the big sperm whale that people are familiar with, where the females are slightly smaller than the males. Actually, they're quite smaller than the males. And it's a big question as to how big the biggest modern sperm whales actually got. There's some evidence that suggests that they got to more than 20 meters in length, and there's this fantastic single source of a whaling ship in the 1800s that says that they caught a male sperm whale, a bull, that was 24 meters in length. So quite possibly the biggest toothed animal that's ever lived in modern times. They're absolutely massive in their own right. There are also the pygmy sperm whales and the dwarf sperm whales, but they only get to around 2 to 3 meters in length. They're deep divers as well. They only have teeth on their lower jaws, extraordinarily strange skulls, hold their breath to very deep depths in order to find their prey. So the anatomy of those animals is really strange. When it comes to Livyatan, the beautiful thing about it is that we still know so very little about it. So the first piece of evidence that we found of this creature was back in 2008 in the middle of a Peruvian desert, not in the ocean or anything like that, in sediments dating to about 7 to 8 million years of age. And the only thing they found was a partial skull. And when the researchers first came across it, they just saw this huge blip on the horizon. They thought it was a baleen whale skull due to the immense size of the individual itself. When they went closer to it, they started to notice that there were these huge tooth sockets in the jaw. And by huge, they have the largest functional teeth of any creature that has ever existed. Now, tusks, they're not functional teeth. They don't count. It's cheating. They're scooping up things, they're fighting. But these teeth, the biggest one that was measured from that skull was 36.2 centimeters in length, like almost the size of a 2-liter Coke bottle. And it had 40 of them studded in its jaws. So it's hard to picture what this creature looks like because we're only looking at the bones of the fossil evidence, but it probably would have looked very similar to modern sperm whales today. It had these fearsome looking teeth, these huge bomby knockers that would have enabled it to take huge chunks of flesh of whatever it was that was eating. But we'd have no idea about what the rest of the skeleton looks like because worldwide, the only other evidence we found of Livyatan are a few ear bones that we found in Bayside, teeth, and then that's it, and this partial skull. So when it comes to identifying its total length, it's a huge piece of guesswork. And at the moment, the current estimate is about 17 meters in length, but that's using the estimates of modern sperm whales against the size of its tremendous skull. So it could have been a lot bigger. And there's also that huge bias that we've only really found a couple of individuals, and that's it. So there's a lot of unpublished material in Chile, for example. I've heard rumors that there are even bigger teeth that are yet to be published. They might be more than 40 centimeters in length. It is such an amazing thing to think that what this landscape would have been like when this creature was alive. It really would have dominated the oceans unlike anything else, very similar to the ecological niche of a great white shark, but more or less like that of the Megalodon when it was alive.
Yeah. And I mean, so modern sperm whales, smaller teeth, and they're, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, suctioning in their prey, going really after giant squids.
Everything about them is so weird, Matt. Like the way in which they eat. Do you know much about that at all?
No, tell us.
So sperm whales do not primarily use their teeth to feed with, even though they are the biggest tooth predator that has probably ever existed. It's so strange to say. So what they have is this huge piston-like tongue located right at the back of their mouth. So they have all their teeth forward of it, which is really strange because you can feel your tongue in your mouth right now. You can feel your teeth, but imagine having all your teeth in front of your tongue. This tongue weighs a metric ton in sperm whales, and essentially what they do is they create a click with their mouth. They create this inverse pressure that sucks things in. And again, some Soviet whalers, there's these first-hand accounts of them when they were hunting them in the 1950s, and they're opening up the bellies of these sperm whales. And when they do, they describe the sperm whale and the contents of the gut within the sperm whale, the giant squid that they're eating, they're still alive, flapping around in their gut, and there's no tooth marks on any of the individuals. That's not to say that they wouldn't have just used their teeth. They might use it to chew every now and again, don't get me wrong. It's entirely plausible that they would have done something like that. But I mean, it's just astounding that what on earth would you use those teeth for? I mean, Matt, from a logistical perspective, what would you use your teeth for if you weren't using them to feed with?
I mean, like mating, I guess, but
yeah,
I've always thought their jaws are super weird, and they're a very unusual creature.
They are they really are. They are the epitome of strange. And essentially what it comes down to, and what many experts believe, is that they use their teeth to spar with one another. At least the big bulls do themselves. So, and these males, they have these horrific scars located all over their big bulbous foreheads. They're called rake marks that you can see from even quite a distance away from where the whale is. If you're swimming like 10, 15 meters away, you can see these individual huge grooves lining their head where another sperm whale has gone to bite them with their huge ivory inset teeth.
I mean, I always thought it was giant squid.
And look, the giant squid do leave marks on them as well. They've got those fantastic suction cups all over their tentacles that have got these tiny little hooks, and they embed in the flesh of these huge animals. But they've got such a huge amount of blubber all over their body, so they can take the punishment.
Yeah. And so how does the jaw of the modern sperm whale that like sucks up squid compare to Leviathan?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because when you look at the muscle attachment sites right at the back of the jaw for a sperm whale, they're quite weak. They're not big and robust and heavy. There's not a large size attributed to right at the back of the jaw. But for Livyatan, it's huge. It's like 5 times the size of what you would expect for a modern sperm whale. So clearly, looking at what the dentition is like, their dentition and their teeth are very similar to killer whales rather than that of actual sperm whales, but they are themselves sperm whales. We're looking at something that would have had a tremendous bite force, and then it just starts spurring on all this speculation. What would an animal have needed that huge bite force for in the first place?
Yeah, and like so because the teeth are quite like well set in, and I was reading that's pretty important to determining what they ate.
Yes, absolutely. Because if you've got teeth that are kind of moving around too much in the lower jaws and such, it's just not going to be very good for you when it comes to prey capture. Whales and dolphins in particular, they've got extraordinary looking teeth. They've adapted their teeth to a whole bunch of things. We talked a little bit about beaked whales before, not much though, but you know, the males have, in some groups, have adapted them to form giant tusks in the lower jaw that are really well set in. You've got river dolphins that have got these needle sharp teeth that are perfect for ensnaring slippery prey. There's a whole caveat. And then of course you've got the baleen whales that have rescinded their teeth into their gum line to strengthen the individual bone, so there's no cavities or anything like it. They've just got this one solid gigantic bone of a lower jaw that continues all the way through.
Yeah. And so,
segue there. You said you wanted segues, right? So, because we can give you as many as you want.
I love a good tangent, a good segue.
Because I love baleen whales. I loved beaked whales.
And I mean, who doesn't love whales? I mean, and with the sperm whale, I've always wondered why people aren't occasionally eaten by sperm whales. Like, they feel like they're a big hunter, but would Leviathan have eaten people?
Oh, I think anything would have been on the menu for Livyatan. Absolutely. It all comes down to their oral cavity and what can actually fit through it. So, I mean, take, for example, a blue whale. Right, their oral cavity, their throat, right at the back of that gigantic, gaping, huge mound of a mouth, is only about the same size as an orange. So you can fit your fists through, but that's it. So when people think that they could get swallowed by a blue whale, it's not possible. They literally cannot swallow you past that point where their mouth is. But with sperm whales, I'm not so sure it's the size of the oral cavity. I imagine it has to be quite large, though, to actually fit in a giant squid. They are taking them on and
they're
potentially
pretty squishy,
eating them whole. Yeah, they're squishy. Exactly. So there's never been any record of a human being attacked by a sperm whale. And again, it highlights that real smartness and intelligence that these animals have in knowing not to attack humans, because we've been attacking them for, centuries, essentially, and absolutely devastated their populations worldwide. But with Livyatan, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that it would have been eating anything and everything. Nothing would have been off the menu for it.
And so the big question, I think, that's all over the internet is, would it have eaten a megalodon?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's no direct evidence at the moment that would suggest it, but we would probably never find that in the fossil record to begin with, because when it comes to finding evidence of the megalodon, all you're really finding are its teeth, a few vertebrae, maybe a few dermal scales and scutes as well from its skin that are also hidden in tiny bits of sediment. So there's not much evidence of the megalodon when it comes to that. There is evidence of an interaction between megatooth sharks like that of the megalodon and smaller species of sperm whale. Livyatan belongs to this giant group known as the killer sperm whales, and they're all placed within this wastebasket taxon that kind of don't make much sense. But the thing that sets them apart from the modern sperm whales, of course, is that upper jaw dentition that they have. So the teeth coming down in the upper jaw. And there's a single tooth that was reported from last year that had a bite mark from a megalodon in the side of it, from a smaller type of killer sperm whale. So we know that that interaction definitely existed between smaller killer sperm whales and the megalodon. And then, of course, you look at modern interactions between animals like orcas and great white sharks. And we know that great white sharks are predated by orcas, but orcas are significantly bigger than great whites, because you're looking at great whites at a body mass of maybe 2 metric tons at their absolute biggest size, compared to an orca. The largest individual can be 10 metric tons, maybe just a little fraction below that. So, and then you've also got 6 or 7 individual orcas working to subdue and take down a single great white shark. When they do eat the great white shark, the only thing they eat are its liver, this fatty liver that makes up a third of their entire body, and they slurp it through like a bit like spaghetti. It's supposed to be really disgusting looking. And then the rest of the carcass of the great white shark washes up on the beach without its liver. And so it's entirely possible that Livyatan might have been doing the same. And who's to say that this ancient type of killer sperm whale was acting alone? It probably lived in pods with many of its own kin. So you can only imagine how hazardous a group of these organisms would have been if they were alive in the modern day.
Yeah. And I mean, thinking about killer whales and thinking about sperm whales, and I guess you can kind of see their brain size based off their kind of skull. What about Livyatan? Would it have been just as smart or smaller or bigger brain? Do we know anything about that?
Unfortunately, the area that housed the brain was never really discovered in the fossil record as part of that partial skull. So there's a lot that we can't really tell about its encephalization quotient. But unfortunately for whales, the encephalization quotient isn't very good anyway to kind of determine whether or not an animal is smart based on its body weight to brain size ratio. So I think across the board, when you look at modern toothed dolphins and whales, you know that they are inherently smart organisms. They do incredible things like echolocation. They would need a big brain, and we know modern sperm whales do have really big brains, the biggest brain in the animal kingdom today. So it kind of lends itself to that theory that, they probably were quite smart creatures. But again, because of the incompleteness of the fossil record, we can never be 100% certain. I'd love to find a complete skull. If we were able to find a complete skull of Livyatan, it might be able to bring out a few more of those answers.
Yeah, I mean, that would be amazing, wouldn't it?
I've been looking everywhere for it. Oh my God, it is on my bucket list of things to find before I die. Unfortunately, the only thing that's really been found in Bayside are their teeth and a few ear bones, and that's it. So to find something like a skull would be monumental, and it would really change the way in which we would be able to work on these creatures.
Yeah. And so, like, another tangent, but how do you go about looking for Leviathan's skull?
It's tricky. And essentially what you need to do is you need to look in the right places for that time frame. And there's only a few of them that really exist all the way across Victoria. The one that I primarily spend the most amount of time looking is in Bayside. So it's about 30 minutes from the CBD of Melbourne on a really good run going right down the Nepean Highway in two places called Black Rock and Beaumaris. They're both beachside localities. So you have to go swimming in order to find the majority of this fossil material. And the first evidence that was found was a single isolated tooth back in 2016 by a member of the public, Murray Orr, citizen scientist, and he thought it was an unexploded ordnance when he actually discovered it for the first time because of its huge size and was about to call the army to come before he realized it was a tooth that had actually fallen from the cliff and actually found its way onto the beach when he was just walking. And he was looking for fossils, but he knew what it was that he was looking for. And then since that time, we found a handful of other teeth. And again, they're huge. They're more than 30 centimeters in length, but we haven't found a skull yet of this creature. But as I say this, there is some very exciting material coming up from the Bellarine Peninsula that could represent this giant killer sperm whale. And I'll end it there. But you can ask me more questions if you want, but it's cool stuff. Man, I don't know what to expect with it.
Yeah. Watch this space.
Yeah, it's so I had one of the citizen scientists, Yeston Griffiths, reach out to me the other day. There's a fossil spot. I can't give away the exact area of it yet because I haven't even gone to see the specimen myself. But he said, I think it's something really exciting. It's a huge jaw that's just embedded in the ground in sediments that are about the same age as you would expect to find Livyatan material in. And when I first saw it, I just kind of dismissed it as a baleen whale jaw. I didn't think much of it whatsoever until it was given to another researcher who looked at it and went, some really strange anatomical oddities within the jaw that look like teeth embedded in it. And when we looked a little bit closer, because it's covered in algae and there's rocks and everything else nearby, it's hard to tell just from images alone. But out of it, there's a couple of images that were then sent to me, and the more I look at it, the more I'm convincing myself that they are actually teeth in the jaw, and they're huge. If they are teeth, they could be more than 10 centimeters across. watch this space. I plan to go down within this month to go and examine the specimen and determine whether or not I think it is what I think it is.
And I mean, if you were like, oh, this is Livyatan, and then someone, some lovely member of the public was like, here's the funds to study it, would you remove it? And how would you go about removing such a huge fossil from the ocean?
Yeah, it's difficult because you can't use glues. So this as the example, this fossil is located at the low tide mark. So there's always water over the top of it. So when you're extracting things, you'd otherwise use a combination of different things to try and get it out. You'd dig a trench around it, and then you'd use like a plaster cast to kind of set the surrounding rock around it so you could take it out carefully before you actually put it on the back of the truck. And then you would do the excavation underneath a microscope with a kind of little like microdermal needle kind of abrading the bits of fossil dirt off the side of the bone. But you won't be able to do this with the specimen because it's in the water. It makes it so much trickier whenever you try to extract any fossil material. So what fundamentally needs to happen, it almost becomes like a smash and grab scenario. And I know that sounds kind of horrific, but there's no other way. If you make a crack, you will have to piecemeal this specimen out chunk by chunk. And the jaw itself, it was measured at 1.8 meters in length. So the feasibility of getting this huge specimen out in one giant chunk is going to be really heavy. And we're really far away from a nearby car as well. So you would have to take each individual section out, bring it up to an area where you could then dry it off. Then you could think about gluing up the specimen and preparing it as best as you could. You then wrap it up, but you would have to break it into a number of pieces before you then took it to the lab where you could then consolidate it. So really tricky stuff. Like working at the beach and underwater is hard. And like I've had scenarios where I found, whale ear bones before and a whole bunch of teeth that have just broken as soon as I found them. Like almost, I remember there was this Megalodon tooth that I found not too long ago. And as soon as I went to go pick it up, it was still connected to the sediment and it broke in about 5 pieces. And so there's nothing you can do underwater. It's just the way it is. So you pick up each of the individual bits, and then when you take it up, you let it dry, you cure it a little bit, you make sure the salts adhering to the surface is then kind of brushed off of it, and then you start to glue everything back together. And it looks like one fossil now. But yeah, it's a huge undertaking to try and take something of a really large size, something bigger than me, out of the water.
Yeah, and an expensive undertaking, I imagine.
It is expensive undertaking as well, because the one thing that most people often forget is, so you've got the fossil, but then you've also got to prepare it, and preparing it takes a hell of a lot of time to do. So there's another skull that's currently in the water that I found in 2020 of a large type of baleen whale in Beaumaris. If we were to take that out, I went to go check out, it's in about 1.5 meters of water. It would take about $15,000 on the day just of the equipment that we would need to take it out and put it on a specific boat, partition it, because it's really heavy stuff. Like the whole block weighs a couple of tons, essentially. Yeah. And then we would need to prepare the specimen out of the rock using air pneumatic tools. And then you would also need some acetic acid to also melt the surrounding sediment from the bone itself. And that could take years. And then you've got to glue it all together. So before you start even looking at it, you start looking at this budget started blowing up incredibly, because these things are expensive to manage. These projects are really hard to kind of formalize and get the funding for in the first place.
Yeah. And so with, say, Bayside, where you've found these teeth before, is it your opinion that the teeth fall out of a smashed jaw and so there's not actually a jaw left? Or would they naturally fall out near the jaw and there's still a jaw and teeth?
Depends on the sediment in which you find it. So there's a few different areas. So there's one specifically that's called the nodule layer. It's called a high energy layer. So what's probably happened before the fossil has come to sit at the bottom of the seafloor, before it's even a fossil 5 million years ago, as it was rolling on the bottom of the seafloor, it would have been broken up into a bunch of different pieces and then fossilized. And so then you only find that single isolated bit of bone. There are definitely circumstances, though, where there are entire jaws and then they are getting broken up into smaller pieces. So one of my favorite stories happens through in 2020 and 2021 when we found a section of beaked whale skull. And it's a beautiful specimen. But the very first specimen was actually found in 1977 by Tim Flannery, former Australian of the Year, when he was a kid. It's the end of the nose of this huge skull. And the skull itself is about, the bit that he found was about 50 centimeters in length. And then when I was diving back in 2020, there was another segment that was found by a citizen scientist that joined directly onto that bit. I was like, okay,
Wow.
there's got to be more. And then in 2021, we found another segment that joined onto that bit of the skull as well. Both scenarios are completely plausible. We are finding specimens that are getting smashed up that should be a lot more complete. And we know that there are jaws out there of killer sperm whales in Bayside that are being obliterated by the time they come out of the fossil sediment, and they're just getting spread around the bottom of the seafloor, and we're just finding tiny little segments of them by the time we come across them as we're diving for it.
Yeah, okay. So the whole animal is probably embedded in the cliff, but as it erodes, it kind of crumbles out. Is that what's kind of happening?
Correct, yeah. And there's the sediment as well also extends completely under the water. So you're getting the active erosion underwater and on the land. And I'd say 95% of the fossil material that I find in Bayside as the example is actually coming under the water itself.
Yeah. Well, so combining Leviathan's found in Melbourne, it's found in Peru. Does that mean it was a worldwide species? Was there more than one species? What do we think on that?
Yeah, it's a good question whether or not there's one or a couple of species that are really there. Hard to say because of the isolated nature of the fossil specimens that we're presented with. I think it's very likely that it probably was this one cosmopolitan species like you find today with modern sperm whales. You know, we just have Phyceta macrocephalus found worldwide. We more than likely would have just had Livyatan melvillei is the species name worldwide as well. So it's been found in Peru. There's one area in the northern hemisphere, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head where it's been found. It's also been found in South Africa as well. So it was primarily found around the southern hemisphere, and that I can't remember the exact placement in the northern hemisphere, but it's only just above the equator. So it won't shock me that we'll find more material of this animal in a whole bunch of different areas. The beautiful thing about Livyatan is that here is this gigantic predator, quite possibly one of the biggest that has ever existed in the history of the world, and we only found out about it in 2008. It was only formally published by the Peruvian scientists in 2010. We had no real knowledge that this animal existed in the fossil record beforehand. So it shows you what's still out there to be found. If you can find something the size of Livyatan, is there something even bigger than it still hanging around in the fossil record waiting to be found?
Yeah. And so what with like it being a fossil and it's obviously extinct, why did an animal like this go extinct, or why is the ocean changed, or what's the current theory?
It's a great question. And fundamentally, as paleontologists, we're always trying to look for those answers, understanding why extinctions of certain groups of animals have occurred. And the stark reality we have with Livyatan is we have no idea in the slightest why this creature died out, because we don't know exactly when it died out. So Bayside and those areas that are roughly 5 to 6 million years of age are currently thought to be the youngest evidence of Livyatan anywhere in the world. But I also know of other areas around the world where they have been found, they haven't been formally published, and that material is significantly younger than Beaumaris and Black Rock. So we know that they survived a lot longer. It's the same. Whatever killed off the Megalodon, I think probably also had a hand in killing off Livyatan as well, because here are these two giant hyper predators coexisting in exactly the same environment, in exactly the same time frame. We know the Megalodon, based on its current evidence, probably died off at about 3.5 million years ago, and it's probably likely that Livyatan also died off at a similar kind of time frame as to that of the Megalodon. But even then, the chronology of when the Megalodon went extinct is still completely hotly debated. There's other fossil areas all around the world that suggest they may have survived until a lot more recently, by even a couple of million years. So it's the beauty of paleontology. A single fossil can change the way in which we view the evolution of an entire group of animal, and therefore the constraints as to why they went extinct in the first place. Always so exciting, that. Oh my goodness. And citizen science for me is one of the most important things, because the things that people have found in the last decade across Victoria have fundamentally changed the way in which we see the evolution of numerous groups of animals across the state, in Australia, and even worldwide as well. And Livyatan is that beautiful example where it is the youngest that we know of to date anywhere in the world. There's also a theory that suggests that, so we know we look look at other killer sperm whales, we don't find any kind of oceanic dolphins in the same fossil deposits. So it's possible that the rise of oceanic dolphins coincided with the fall of those killer sperm whales, and maybe they were outcompeted by one another. We don't currently have fossil evidence to suggest that orcas were actually responsible for the demise of killer sperm whales either. Orcas are tremendous predators. They can basically eat anything they want in the ocean. They choose not to eat us, which is just so fantastic of them to decide not to do that in the first place. The earliest evidence is from Japan from about 3 and a bit million years, Orcinus citianensis. But even the morphology and the characteristics of that skull are quite gracile. They're not as big and chunky and don't have this fearsome looking head like modern orcas do. So it was clearly eating something very different many millions of years ago than what it was probably eating today, and then evolved into that niche of a macro predator over time, probably because the Megalodon and other killer sperm whales were not around. So we know that the beginning of the ice ages was also at about 3.5 million years ago, the last big fluctuating ice ages. That would have also impacted many of the food sources that they ate, and such a myriad of reasons as to why it could have gone extinct. And I don't think there's a single explanation that can give it. I think there's all these cascading things that happen at exactly or roughly near the same time that results in the ultimate downfall of Livyatan, the smaller killer sperm whales, and even the Megalodon as well. But we don't fully understand the mechanisms that control that extinction as of this moment.
Yeah, and I guess such big animals need so much food, and they're often going to be the first ones to go because they're in smaller number. And then I think we spoke about it on the Megalodon podcast, how great whites may have hunted junior megalodons. And so, that's true. I guess the same thing can be said with Livyatan and other whales and dolphins.
Yeah, obviously the food and their prey is probably very indicative of the reason why they went extinct. And we know that there was a trend, for example, in baleen whales, which could have been their food source for many millions of years. They started to get really big in the fossil record at around that time, and there's less of a trend for them to have been really small. So in Bayside and Beaumaris, the vast majority, and I'd say 95% of the baleen whales that we find there, so just for your listeners out there, if you're not so sure what a baleen whale is, include modern varieties like the humpback and the blue today. They have the large keratinous rack in the upper mouth that they use to filter out that looks a bit like a mustache. And 5 to 6 million years ago, these baleen whales primarily were relatively small. There were a few giant varieties, but at around 3 to 4 million years ago in the fossil record, we see it shift. And then there's really only big ones that exist, but there are still small ones hanging around. There's pygmy right whales are still alive today. They're the smallest type of baleen whale, and they're only 6 meters in length. They may weigh more than an elephant, but they're still small by baleen whale standards. So I don't think it's sufficient of enough of a reason for that animal to have gone extinct. And if you're a big predator, you probably were eating on a whole bunch of different things. So I don't think you would have just been limiting yourself to just whales for that reason. And again, you start to look at those things and you're like, but why would this animal have ever gone extinct in the first place? It doesn't make any sense for it to have flourished for so many millions of years, just like the Megalodon did. The lineage that led to the Megalodon had been around on the planet for over 100 million years, and they'd gotten to their absolute largest size of about 3 million years ago. And then they died out. And again, there's no real consensus as to why that is.
Yeah, it's such a cool mystery. And yeah, and so you kind of spoke about how baleen whales work, but I've been reading about sperm whales and Livyatan, and that's some weird stuff. So, tell us why they're called sperm whales and what the mystery about that is.
So, when the whalers were actually going to harvest the spermaceti within their giant forehead, this giant organ that's located within just above the top of their skull, as it hits the air, it looks like sperm. So the sailors were like, well, this must be where it keeps its testicles, essentially, this huge, gigantic,
in its head
sack, essentially, in its head. That makes sense, of course. So, but we know that's not actually the case. So what these animals do is one of the most remarkable incredible things in the animal kingdom. They have this form of biological sonar called echolocation. And there's a few different animals that are capable of it. We know that microbats are capable of doing it, and they fly around, and you might be familiar with them making those clicking noises to kind of get the frequency of where their prey is in the air. But sperm whales and all toothed whales, modern toothed whales, are capable of doing it too. It's an extraordinary adaptation to a marine world, essentially, because they dive down to depths below 200 meters. And as you get to 200 meters, it starts to turn into pitch blackness. You can't see much around you whatsoever. So you have to start relying on these other adaptations that you have. And for sperm whales, what they do is, and every single part of the story is insane, Matt. They only have one nostril, one single blowhole right at the end of that gigantic bulbous head. The other nostril that they once had has now been modified as an organ that generates sound. So they have this weird structure called the monkey lips that create a really loud, piercing click. And essentially what it does is it goes through some of the spermaceti organ that's located within their giant head. Their head is shaped like a satellite dish, and it's shaped very deliberately like so to amplify that single click that's generated by that single organ in the top of their head. It then runs through both of the organs within their skull. There's another one that's called the junk just underneath the spermaceti organ. It then goes out into the gloom of the ocean, and they can't see anything in front of them until it bounces off an object. That sound that bounces off the object is then received through their very dense lower jaw. It goes through to a fatty pad that is then connected to their ear bones, and they're able to make three-dimensional sense of a world in pitch black. So the echolocation of whales is so beautiful, because it's just something that we've never really gotten a real handle on as hominids at all. But understanding how clear the message is when they receive those clicks from the gloom is just so fascinating. So when it comes to dolphins, for example, dolphins, they can also echolocate. You be familiar with the clicking noises that they make as well. When they're put into a pool with a pregnant woman, they're fascinated what they can see, and they're clicking like crazy. And they can, because what they're doing is they're utilizing echolocation, this form of kind of sonar, biological sonar, to actually see the developing fetus of the female inside of her by use of this echolocation. It's remarkable. But beaked whales, and we mentioned them before. Oh, I loved beaked whales. I'll come on and do an episode about beaked whales in the future as well. They take it to another extreme. There was a paper that was out earlier this year. I can't remember who the authors were, but they suggested that the reason why there's this huge ornamentation in the skull of these males is because they're using that biological sonar to actually identify the males from the females. So even though they look exactly the same, other than the giant tusks located in their lower jaw, they're able to basically do this weird x-ray of their head through the use of this echolocation to determine whether or not they're male or female. So it shows you just how powerful it is for this creature and what they might be capable of. But the really cool thing though, Matt, Livyatan was capable of echolocation, and it may have even properly weaponized it in a way that is not properly fulfilled by other dolphins and maybe even sperm whales today.
Yeah, like, so let me kind of imagine. So what is it, putting out a click so loud that it kind of shocks its prey, like a shotgun?
It's more than likely that modern sperm whales are actually doing that when it comes to giant squid. So the loudest it can get is 236 decibels, which could shatter my eardrums if I was next to it in the water. So I don't know what effect it's having on a squid, though, I must admit. So whether or not that...
I do know that there's some research out about the sound, what happens when big boat motors and those seismic blasts go past octopus. And it actually damages their brain and causes them to kind of lose the ability to know which way is up and down, which is horrible for them. But maybe Livyatan and like sperm whales are doing that.
Look, I think it would only make sense from a sperm whale perspective to be emitting that loud, piercing click as soon as you're next to the organism, because it would disable them to some extent. If they're not knowing which way is up or down in the water column, it would make really easy prey. And so you've got to imagine the scene, Matt. There's Livyatan. It's hunting its prey. It can see the baleen whale at the surface as it's coming up for that giant gulp of air that it has through its nostrils. When it sees it, and as it starts clicking, it starts getting louder and louder. Maybe what it does is it emits such a loud, piercing click that it breaks its ear bones or something like that, or traumatizes it to such an extent that it's not capable of reacting to the predator in a satisfactory way, and then it bites off the fluke of the tail and goes off in another direction. So we live in a time where this is probably happening with giant squid and sperm whales today, where they've weaponized this echolocation. It is so cool to think of what Livyatan might have used it for in the past as well.
Yeah, and I mean, the biggest question that comes from that is, if they're using this as a weapon, can they still hear? And how do they protect their own hearing?
Good question, actually. I'm not entirely sure how to answer this because, I mean, so if sperm whales are capable, modern sperm whales are capable of generating those kind of noises, they're clearly protecting their own ears. I know that there's no external output for what they want, for the vestigial kind of eardrum, essentially, because whales once walked on land, and so they would have had external ears, and they would have had holes to where their eardrums would have gone as well, to the 3 tiny little inner ear ossicles, which modern whales still have to some extent. I'm aware that many whales have huge amounts of earwax that build up in that kind of area, where the vestigial area where that ear hole used to be. So maybe that's creating enough of a barrier to protect them against those kind of supersonic noises that they create.
Built-in earplugs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
There's some really cool images online of the earplugs. They're quite thick, like they're probably thicker than my entire hands in terms of all the wax that builds up in them. And they can never get rid of it either. So it just gradually grows and grows and grows.
Yeah, well, it must be for a reason. Well, that's kind of like getting us a little bit to the end. But before we wrap up, are there any other cool facts about Livyatan or sperm whales in general that we haven't covered that you think we definitely need to mention?
Man, I don't know. We have covered a hell of a lot of them, haven't we? I'm trying to think right now, and nothing's coming to my mind. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with all the questions that you asked before. They are unlike many different creatures that are alive today. The thing that really sets them apart from modern sperm whales is that they probably were eating very, very large prey in a way that modern sperm whales could never imagine doing. I love those questions that still remain unanswered about Livyatan that can only be answered with more fossil evidence. And I hope the next time you get me on the show and we talk about this in the future, we have a little bit more evidence, more skulls from other sides of the world where we can start to say, okay, I think I can build enough of a picture of what this creature really, really looks like.
And so what's the biggest mystery you want to solve?
It's a tricky one for paleontologists because... there's so many aberrant forms of creatures that have appeared in the fossil record that no one was expecting to find. Like you think about sauropods and long-necked dinosaurs. Before anyone ever found a long-necked dinosaur, no one was expecting to find a creature of that size, of something that lived on land. It's extraordinary. So the fossil evidence very much dictates what we still want to be able to tell with those stories. And for me, I know that there are a lot of stories that still remain very unanswered when it comes to the fossil record of Australia. So, the evolution of whales, and particularly baleen whales in the modern record, when did they start losing their teeth? Why did they start losing their teeth? There's some questions that we really don't fundamentally know the answers to, that we might know if we find the right kind of fossils to begin with. How big did Livyatan really get? So I alluded to a little bit earlier in this podcast that there were 40 centimeter teeth from Chile. They're not published. There's no formal reporting of anything like that. I've only seen pictures and secondhand accounts from the scientists down in that area. But I think Livyatan got a bit bigger than what we're currently estimating at the moment of 17 meters in length. And it's a huge estimate. So we might be able to find that really exciting evidence that points to just how big it really was getting.
Yeah. Move aside Megalodon, Livyatan. Because I mean,
there's nothing like it.
That skull in Peru could have been a juvenile, really, or a female and the male's bigger, and anything like that. Well,
yeah, exactly. So you just alluded to the perfect point. Female sperm whales are much smaller than the large sperm whales bulls that you get today. So is what we're looking at a female Livyatan? And again, in the fossil record, it's so impossible to tell whether or not you're looking at a male or a female in most instances. Usually there is a good indication that the individual that's there, the epiphyses of the bone are relatively well sutured together. So we can tell that it probably was in an adult stage, but, adults vary in modern sperm whales. So how much bigger could this animal have gotten? Is there another massive hyper predator existing in the fossil record that we have no idea about? It's possible.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we might kind of wrap up the show, but if people want to see answers to this and they want to see new discoveries and see all the stuff you do, what should they do and where should they go?
The easiest way for anyone to get into contact with me is just to follow me on my Instagram. It's a fool's experiment, _fools_experiments. I've also got a Patreon as well where people can donate to help me go out into the field and find this kind of material. And it's fantastically a huge resource for me to be able to launch these expeditions and find this material, because everything that I do find and have mentioned already on this podcast, I give to the state collection so that we can study it in perpetuity. So that way there's always going to be something there for the future, for future scientists, even if that's 100 years down the track.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much for being on the show.
Thank you. It was really fun. Man, I love reminiscing about sperm whales. they're just the coolest animals ever. Move aside Megalodon, Livyatan, and modern sperm whales. They're the extraordinary ones.
Oh, I think we almost need to do another episode just about sperm whales.
Absolutely. Well, you just let me know when you want me back, and I'll be there. Thanks, man.
Seacreatures Podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by myself, Matt Testoni. Jump onto our Instagram account, which is Seacreatures_podcast, to learn more about what's coming up on the show. If you like the show, visit buymeacoffee.com/MattTestoni to help out with the running costs of the show and ensure more episodes are coming your way soon. So thank you to Cassie, Matt, Hannah, Jesse, Tim, Deanna, Kelly, Adriana, Michelle, Steph, and Georgia for buying me a coffee to help with the running costs of the show. If you'd like to see my photography, visit Matt_Testoni_photography for all kinds of cool underwater creatures from around the world. Coming up next time on the Sea Creatures Podcast, we're going to be discussing a few quirky sea creatures, such as the vampire squid, with comedian Kirsty Waybeck. This has been the Sea Creatures Podcast. Over and out.